Hello, and welcome to a bonus episode of Preservation for the People.
When we were recording our interview for episode 2, we just had such a great conversation with Dr. Ayana Flewellen. Then there was so much great content that we were having trouble deciding what to keep in and take out. However, we only want our podcast episodes to be so long. So we've crafted this bonus episode for you all in case you were curious about the other things we had to say in the interview with Dr. Flewellen.
Let's get into it.
There's not a hope that every middle schooler or high schooler who comes through this is going to leave with like the desire to always have a trowel in their hand. But there is a real want that whatever kind of field that they move into that captures their passion, their interest, that they move towards that with this sense of cultural stewardship.
Well, still on the subject of youth, like what does it mean to you to be a person that the younger generation can look up to when they may not see individuals that look like them in the field?
I don't know. I think it's really interesting. In the last maybe 2 years, more outlets catered towards children have been featuring me, along with the work that I do, is just featured in like this Junior Scholastic like magazine, which is the cutest thing because I remember being so excited for the Scholastic Book Fair every time it came to my school.
Yeah.
So to like now be in a Junior Scholastic and like, what? This is amazing. And there's this other book called Joy, which is like just an animated book of all these different African-American, African diasporic people doing different careers, like a bird watcher, an archeologist, a chef, a social media influencer. I think it's been really wonderful to see these outlets like really wanting to transform how our babies see the possibilities for themselves in this world. And I really appreciate that. I'm someone who never heard the term archaeologist growing up, did not know what anthropology was, which is where archaeology is housed in North America. Did not know what that was until college. So the kind of exposure, I think, is really transformative. And a short kind of like tangent, but like when this book came out, some random family reached out to me to tell me that their young son, who's like a toddler, loved that section of the book. And then went out into the backyard and started digging in the backyard, pretending that he was like Dr. Flewellen with a trowel. And then they sent me a picture of this young boy. And I was like, I want this child. Like, I don't like, it was the cutest thing ever. I showed it to my mother as well. I was like, look at this curly haired Black boy who wants to be an archaeologist. And he's like maybe 4 years old and is just excited to be in the backyard, finding what he could in the dirt there. That's really amazing. And who knows what will happen for him, but like world exposure to like various kinds of activities at such a young age is so much is possible when you can see yourself in that position and space.
Thank you for that tangent. That was very cute to hear.
It was too cute. I was like, I will steal your child. What are you doing? This is too adorable.
The children are our future. And so I wanted to know, like, what big hopes and dreams do you have for the future of archaeology, the field, anything? Where do you want to see it go? And what do you want to see it become?
Yeah, I feel like last year there was this huge debate around African American studies in schools, right? And there's been this huge kind of talking about, okay, how is it exactly that we teach our youth in K through 12 settings about the actual core foundation of our country, right? Being one of like Indigenous displacement, African enslavement, and exploitative labor practices. Like, how do we actually teach this so that we don't replicate this in the future? So I feel like for archaeology, the future of our field is to actually engage in the present moment and make our work relevant. There are ways that these conversations around the denial of particular histories actually cannot be denied when you have the physical remnants of that history laid in front of you. And I think
Mhm.
that part of my own work, especially someone who focuses on slavery, I could talk about the harsh realities of slavery, as well as the ways in which our ancestors built communities, love, raised children in those spaces, because there's materiality that actually shows the complexity of all of that. So I really do feel like archaeology has oftentimes been siloed, often by the practitioners themselves, and not engaged in these contemporary discussions about the politics of place, the politics of material culture, the politics of heritage. And this is a particularly apt moment to really stand in the power of our field, to really present tangible history to people, so that when you ask children who were born in 2000 to envision the kind of life ways of the enslaved, yes, it was several hundred years ago. It wasn't that long ago. You can come with me and we could feel the actual walls of their homes. You could touch the dolls that their children played with, the tools that they actually use to produce the cotton, the sugar, the coffee that undergird these economies. Like that brings it closer to people so that they understand the impact of it today. And I don't think that archaeologists do the best job of making those contemporary connections.
Yeah, for sure. I got my bachelor's in archaeology.
Cool.
So it's been a while since I've interacted with like purely archaeological thoughts, but it's so interesting just thinking about my own education and stuff like that. And I'm like, you're right. It never really felt connected to contemporary in any kind of way. But I do want to start to talk about your tentative book and just wondered if you wanted to give it a little brief introduction and some context before we really get into the questions here.
Yeah, sure. The book project is tentatively titled The Will to Adorn Black Women in Sartorial Practice Post Enslavement. And it's currently under advanced contract with Princeton University Press, which I'm really excited for. I have a fantastic editor. And the book itself really does this kind of arc where we're thinking about the kind of moment of emancipation and thinking about Nancy in this space. And Nancy is a young woman who, in her 30s in 1862, left the Hermitage Plantation twice. And the woman who enslaved her, which was Sarah Jackson, Andrew Jackson Jr.'s wife, wrote a letter articulating that Nancy had left the Hermitage not once, but twice. And on the second leave, she took all her clothing and bedding. So we open up the book thinking about the importance of clothing, of bedding, of textiles, of the small finds that would have held clothing together, to really articulate the importance of cloth textiles during and after the Civil War, and thinking about how textiles themselves, especially in Nashville, which played such a key role for both Union and Confederacy initiatives. One of the core things that generals were saying once the Union gained control of Nashville was the need for cloth for all of the self-emancipated African Americans that were building what we now call contraband camps, which are these communities outside of Union camp spaces. They needed cloth and textiles. They needed clothing. They needed cloth for tents. So there's a way that in this first chapter, I really talk about how clothing became the kind of portable currency that African Americans could use during that time period. And we look towards the Hermitage Plantation collection to kind of play with the idea of what Nancy may have taken, with her while also articulating the reality that Nancy herself was known to be a seamstress. So it's not only about the kind of value of the cloth, the value of the textiles, the value of the linen, but the ways in which she could have transformed that as well and could have used her own labor and skills during the Civil War. And then we moved towards Sarah and Ransom Williams in Texas to think about Reconstruction and particularly Black land ownership. And I turned towards another small find that's typically understudied, which are shoe and shoe fragments. And I looked specifically at these shoe button hooks, which there's one that's really ornate in the collection, and then 3 or 4 fragments of rather plain, just loop designs. But these shoe button hooks were used to button your shoes, which are these really, I think, rather beautiful style of shoes, these button shoes in the late 19th century site. And I took a particular interest in shoes because I don't think that shoes are talked about as much and examined as much within archaeological research. But more than that, within work progress administrative ex-slave narratives that were taken in the 19th, several of formerly enslaved African Americans, and these were people who were generally children during the time of emancipation, but they have vivid memories of shoes. Their lack of shoes, if they did not have any, which oftentimes comes up that they didn't have their first pair of shoes until after emancipation. Or they talk about the kind of hard, harsh nature of their shoes and shoe cobblers that were oftentimes enslaved men at these plantation sites with leather sole, with leather framings that were created sometimes by women. So within that, I talk about what it means to not only live at a site that was not only just Sarah and Ransom Williams, but their children as well, and what it meant to provide their children with protection for their feet when during enslavement and likely during their own childhood, they might not have had that themselves. So I talk about what it means to navigate the topography of Reconstruction and Texas and point towards the feet themselves and the objects of protection that mothers give their children to do that kind of work and labor. And then towards the turn of the 20th century, Sarah's husband, Ransom, passes away, and she actually relocates with the remainder of her children to Austin, Texas. So I also talk about the kind of failure of Reconstruction and once again, the need to navigate a topography of anti-Blackness in Texas that requires women specifically to be in urban spaces for their safety. So the chapter that follows Sarah moves to a different urban context. So rather than situating itself in Austin, Texas, I actually turned towards the Dallas Freedman Cemetery, where a portion of that cemetery was excavated in the 1990s because the state of Texas wanted to expand a highway that intersected with this cemetery, which oftentimes, mind you, is how a lot of African American sites throughout this country are recovered, are from these infrastructure projects that take place in cultural resource management firms that then go out to assess these sites. So the Dallas Freedman Cemetery site is unique because it's the largest number of individuals who were interred that have been excavated. And that collection consists of over 1,100 individuals that were buried there post-slavery through 1907. And within that chapter, I struggled a lot with what it means to even have access to this data. And we talk about the ethics of this work. We talk about, for me, the kind of practice of Black archaeological practices of care and love when it comes to engaging with materials and belongings that were placed on people's bodies when they were laid to rest. But the largest question that I have in that chapter is it possible to have an interpretive framework about Black life and livability at a site of Black internment, especially at these particular sites where what you bear witness to through ancestral remains is the kind of malnourishment, the kind of symptoms of long term racism that actually, while race itself is a social construct, shows up on our skeletons, right? And malnourishment shows up on the actual skeletal frame and the kind of ways in which backbreaking labor of laundressing, of hoeing agricultural fields will show up on the body. But I was determined in my own practice of like desiring to seek out, find, articulate spaces of Black livability, was dedicated to trying to find a way to think through material culture to tell an otherwise story that wasn't trapped in the enclosure of racial subjection. So to do that, the chapter looks at personalized objects that likely would have been worn by the individuals during their life. And I look specifically at one particular object, which is a name pin that was worn by a woman named Lorena. And Lorena's name pin is the only of its kind. There was one other name pin that was recovered, but it was illegible. So the name itself is lost. And the cemetery itself, due to racist practices in the 1920s, when it was initially intentionally erased from the Dallas landscape, burial markers at that site were removed. So there are no names of individuals who were interred here, especially with scarce documentary sources pertaining to death records of African Americans during that time period. So to have a name pin is significant in that regard. And to have recovered a name pin, to almost hear the kind of echo of someone's name from the past that's cutting through the kind of visceral violence that has shaped how we've come to it, I think is pretty significant. So I think about what it means to name yourself in the urban context of Dallas, Texas, at the kind of fall of Reconstruction, when there's so much scaffolding Black life and Black women's lives at this time that is a byproduct of continued ongoing subjection. Yet here someone is claiming their name. So I talk about, I think through those particular objects, personalized objects, engraved objects that try to get us closer to an individual and bring us closer to the humanity of people in that way. And then the book itself closes by thinking about artists who are currently engaged in work around sartorial practices from the antebellum, postbellum period, to think about the kind of importance of sartorial choice in the past and in the present. And that's been a lot of fun. So one particular artist that I looked at is Fabiola Jean-Louis, who has these gorgeous paper dresses that are made in these Victorian styles that she models with African American or African descendant models to really think about the kind of whimsy, fantastical ideas of dress during this time period, but also the fragility of it all with the actual material itself being made of paper. And then I'm looking at reenactors as well, who are like setting up booths in like 18th century garb to think about how the eruption of Black women and dress in particular ways in our contemporary moment allows us to confront these histories and how the legacies of them show up today. So yeah, that reenactor from Not Your Mama's History. I don't know if y'all are familiar, with Chani, but amazing work.
Yeah, this is just like mind blowing for me. I'm over here. So I'm just gonna process.
Yeah, I'm really excited.
Yeah. Before we end, the one thing I was thinking about throughout this whole time, we can keep in our memories this history that may have not been acknowledged.
Mm-hmm.
This is cliche, but to keep the memory alive of these people who may have made things that aren't extraordinary, but ordinary. And that's like perfectly fine. Like that's essential. That's important.
I think the only way for us to envision our future is to understand our past and to hold on to the memories that shape our past. The only way to make sense of this current moment is to understand history, is to understand how we got to this place. And archaeology is so keen and apt to do that work. And it doesn't just happen in our K through 12 textbook spaces. It happens in place as well. It happens when you're in those spaces. Down in St. Croix, when we take youth on tours of the estate Little Princess, we bring them inside of the remains of one of these duplexes that would have housed between 5 to 10 enslaved Afro-Caribbeans in this space during the colonial period. And students in the actual quarters. And that's not to like bring that kind of bodily or trauma response, but it is to produce a kind of awareness of the reality of it. Can you actually imagine it? It's unimaginable, but can you actually even attempt to reach towards it? My colleague, Justin Donovan, has this phrase, remind, recover, remember. And part of it is just really thinking about how it is that we uphold the practice of memory work within our own families, within institutions, within communities, to really shape how we want to think of ourselves, envision ourselves in the future, which is why turning it right back around, circling it right back around to conservation and preservation, it becomes so important to conserve these histories, right? To conserve these objects so that we can preserve this history, so that we can continue to share this history.
I have one more question just on the topic of just general like Black feminist archaeology and Blackness and gender and archaeology. Like, who are some of the voices that have inspired you, like the people who you turn to and have influenced your work?
Yeah, of course. You always have to shout out to the folks whose shoulders upon which you stand, right? Like, so I think specifically within anthropology, the work that I do is only made possible through the scholarship of Zora Neale Hurston and the kind of ways in which in the 1930s she engaged anthropology and said that this is actually a lens through which I could talk about Black life, right? I could talk about Black women's lives specifically. I could talk about our everyday life and it be knowledge, it be important, it be value, and bring that to the public in a particular way. So this work is only possible because she dared to do that and had so many people tell her as well what wasn't anthropological enough, right? That the scholarship she was doing, there was all these kind of dialogue around it. Then it wasn't until Black feminists took up her legacy and was like, no, she's a part of our pantheon. She's a part of our foundation. She's a part of the foundation, not only just for Black women and Black anthropologists, but for this discipline at large. So I really hold on to Zora because of it. Second to that is Toni Morrison. And Toni Morrison's text, The Site of Memory, she has an article in there, I think, called Playing in the Dark. And she has this articulation that the scholarship that she's doing is not interested in articulating facts, but uncovering truths. And there is a way that I remember reading that in graduate school, and I was like, done. This is what I do. This is what I do. I am working in the legacy of Toni Morrison, thinking about the interior lives of enslaved African Americans and their descendants, and I'm not interested in state upheld understandings of facts regarding those experiences, but some form of truth in them. And I was like, archaeology can do that. Material culture can do that. So Toni Morrison is definitely there. And then within the field, the first Black woman to get her degree in anthropology with a focus in archaeology was in 1989, a year before I was born. And it was Teresa Singleton, who still teaches at Syracuse University.
Wow.
Who's published the anthology that I still have my students read today in my classes at Stanford called I Too Am American, African American. I think it's heritage and history. But it's about the kind of early works in the 1990s, Ayana? Late 1990s, early 2000s, but I want to say late 1990s, began asking innovative questions about African American archaeology and what archaeology can add to the dialogues rather than replicating historical interpretations of the past that were thought of to be true. Like, what new can we ask of these spaces, and how can archaeology do that for us? Her work is instrumental, and she's still writing. She's still working. She is still out here doing it. You know? So Teresa made so much possible for African diaspora archaeology as a whole, and then specifically the kind of work that Black women are doing in this field. And then you have Maria Franklin, who is also one of the early pioneers, Black women pioneers within archaeology, who got her degree out of UC Berkeley and who was my chair of my dissertation committee. And she published a text in 2001 titled A Black Feminist Inspired Archaeology. And that was the first articulation of Black feminist theory within historical archaeology. It was beautiful. It was mind-blowing. And all it really did was ask a very simple question. What would it look like if we returned to the sites that we excavated and asked very gender-specific questions about Black women's lives? And she did that being reflective of her own work at a plantation site, saying that if I had done that work, I would have turned towards these more homogeneous spaces where Black women were gathering, if it were these laundering spaces, these kitchen spaces, to think about how space, body, gender could have articulated a different interpretation of the past than what I had put forth in my initial writings and works. Very beautiful. And then building off of Maria's work, Maria's first student, Whitney Battle Baptiste, publishes a book in 2011 titled Black Feminist Archaeology. So Whitney Battle Baptiste in 2011 publishes a Black Feminist Archaeology. And that's like a decade apart from her mentor, who wrote that Black feminist inspired piece, where she also talks about what it means to think about intersectionality as a framework through which we interpret past lifeways, to not only be able to share more about the lived experiences of Black women, but to provide a framework to think about differences across gender, race, across geographic region, across age, when we're thinking about slavery and post-slavery sites, which is really exciting. And then also doing the work twofold of highlighting Black women who were pioneers in this field, like the Black women who worked along white women and other white male archaeologists at the Irie Mound site in Georgia, excavating a Native American, likely a burial mound. But those were all Black. There were these beautiful images of these all Black women crews out in the 1930s. And Whitney pulls that back into our public imagination because, like we were talking about at the start of this conversation, it matters to see yourself here. So it matters that you could turn to the 1930s and see Black women holding trials and doing this field labor, but also acting as experts who knew quite a bit about what they were excavating. So those are the kind of people who lay at the foundation of the scholarship that I do. And then, of course, you have like other sort of critical and foundational Black studies theorists like Sadiya Hartman, Christina Sharp, Catherine McKendrick, especially when I think about Black heritage sites. Yeah, those are just a few that come to mind right now.
That was fantastic. Admire your ability to pull dates out of your head. That's like the one piece of information that doesn't stick in my brain at all. That you said all of the years and everything. I feel like what a great way to close. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah.